You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 335, The State of Franklin. Now, last time we covered the Continental Congress's focus on setting up some form of governance for what would be called the Northwest Territory. Now, there were, however, some other Western territories whose fate was still undecided. And this week, we're going to talk about another of those Western territories that was proclaimed the State of Franklin. Now, North Carolina had some basis for a land claim that reached all the way to the Mississippi River. Most of its population, however, lived near the coast. Settlers had moved as far west as the Appalachian Mountains, but few had crossed those mountains into what was regarded as Cherokee territory. Like all new states, North Carolina was deeply in debt from the costs of fighting the war. The Continental Congress was encouraging states to cede Western lands as a way of providing an asset to pay off old war debt. The North Carolina legislature, though, had a different idea. They argued that the Cherokee had given up any legal claims to the land since they backed the British during the war. In April 1783, the legislature opened up millions of acres of Western lands for the bargain price of £10 per 100 acres. The money could be paid using specie certificates. These were certificates issued during the war that could be exchanged for gold and silver at some later time. The states did not have that specie, so it offered certificate holders this land in exchange. Now, part of the problem with this is that most people had already sold their certificates at a discount to speculators who had paid them pennies on the dollar. These speculators, many of whom were also legislators or their friends and relatives, had an inside track on Western land purchases. These land buyers, mostly insiders, bought up 4 million acres in a matter of months. The act that permitted this quickly became known as the Land Grab Act. At the time all this was happening, there were already quite a few settlements in these Western lands. Those who had settled there were known as the Over-Mountain Men. These men had played a critical role not only in keeping the Cherokee contained and not overrunning the rest of North Carolina, they had also played an important role in fighting the British, particularly at Kings Mountain. The state owed many of these men money for their wartime service, but had not paid them, not even with those paper specie certificates that could have been used to buy Western lands. Instead, the insiders were able to buy up the land before the war debts got paid. In the spring of 1784, groups of Over-Mountain Men petitioned the state legislature for payment of the money owed them from the war. The Easterners, of course, preferred not to pay and accused the Over-Mountain Men of fabricating claims that would have to be paid off through higher taxes on the larger Eastern population. Instead, in May 1784, the legislature shut down the land office that was selling Western lands. A few weeks later, it voted to cede 29 million acres west of the Alleghenies to Congress to form new Western territories. Now, they weren't doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. They were hoping to use this grant to pay off claims that they owed to Congress, and they also wanted to reduce the valuation of the state overall, since there was discussion about taxing states based on their overall state valuation. It also gave them an additional argument for no longer being liable for the claims being made by the Over-Mountain Men, since those men were no longer part of North Carolina. This would be land controlled by Congress, and Congress should be responsible for paying off the war debts for the men who lived there and had defended it during the war. The legislature also voted to renege on promised payments to the Cherokee as compensation for any claims they still had to the land. When these payments stopped, the Cherokee began attacking the frontier settlements again, killing the Western settlers and looting their property. Now, since Congress had not yet accepted this land, the settlers living in the region had no government protection, either from the state or Congress. They were on their own. In August, local community leaders from Washington, Sullivan, and Greene counties met in Jonesboro to come up with a new government for the region. they opted to form a new state separate from North Carolina. They would name their new state Franklin in honor of Benjamin Franklin. There are no good records of the convention itself. The only information we have consists of documents that were written at a later time. But we know that the delegates elected John Sevier as the convention president. I've discussed Sevier in earlier episodes. He was a leader among the Over-Mountain men. He had fought in Lord Dunmore's War in 1774 and was a colonel of militia during most of the American Revolution. One of his more notable contributions was as one of the commanding officers at Kings Mountain. Most of Sevier's combat experience came as an Indian fighter. In recent years, he had led several campaigns against the Chickamauga, who were fighting under Dragging Canoe. Sevier had also served in the North Carolina legislature during the Revolutionary War. He'd grown frustrated by the Assembly's unwillingness to protect the interests of the Over-Mountain men. They wouldn't open courthouses in the West, and they provided little support for the continued fighting with the Indians on the frontier. Now, at the convention, several delegates made speeches for secession and forming an independent state. One delegate read from a copy of the U.S. Declaration of Independence and explained that many of the same reasons that caused the colonies to seek independence from Britain also applied to their need to be independent of North Carolina. The delegates voted unanimously in favor of independence. Delegates then voted on rules for holding a constitutional convention a few months later. They agreed to select delegates based on the size of militia companies, and they also agreed to send a delegate to the Continental Congress in New York to enter into negotiations to join the Union as the 14th state. There was some debate about whether portions of southwestern Virginia should also be included as part of the new state of Franklin. Delegates also voted that sheriffs and tax collectors should hold any public monies already collected for North Carolina and not send the money east until a proper accounting and division of money could be made. The delegates would return home to let the people vote on new delegates for a constitutional convention that would meet in December. Even before the August meeting was over, officials in North Carolina were expressing concerns about what was happening. The independence movement in the West was based on North Carolina's decision to cede those western lands to Congress. The vote to cede those lands had been a close one, with many of those on the losing side feeling very strongly that this was a mistake. Over the summer of 1784, new delegates were elected to the North Carolina legislature. Western independence was a big issue in many campaigns, and quite a few delegates who had voted for the cession were replaced by opponents of cession. When the new legislature met in October, both the Assembly and the Senate voted to reconsider the cession of Western lands and voted decisively to repeal that cession. Of course, there were no delegates from the western counties present, since they had already declared their independence. A large minority of delegates objected to these votes on the age-old rule of no takebacks. As one delegate put it, quote, "The grant by the act of cession is irrevocable on the part of the state, and therefore this repeal is disgraceful." There is no specific reference to the independence votes that had taken place in Jonesboro, but the delegates were likely well aware of the independence movement in the West. To help mollify the situation, the delegates voted to create a judicial district for the western counties, something that they had been demanding for a long time. They also voted to form a new western militia into a brigade and named John Sevier as the new brigadier general in command of this militia. While the eastern part of the state was trying to undo everything and go back to being one big happy state again, the Westerners were moving forward with their plans for independence. Following local elections, Western delegates met again in Jonesboro in December, and once again they elected John Sevier to preside over the convention. Again, the delegates voted on independence. Perhaps based on North Carolina's decision to repeal the land cession and pass conciliatory measures for the western counties, the vote was not unanimous this time. Even so, the vote, quote, "forming ourselves into a separate and distinct state, independent of the state of North Carolina," won the vote 28-15. The convention voted on a constitution for their new state. In fact, it was quite similar to the North Carolina Constitution. The document itself began with a Declaration of Independence. The document said that North Carolina's decision to cede their lands left them without a government. It noted the failure to provide resources sufficient to keep the Indians on the frontier contented, thus resulting in threats to their communities. They also noted how far removed they were from the eastern part of the state and separated by a mountain range. After the Declaration came a 25-part Bill of Rights. This was, again, very similar to the North Carolina Bill of Rights, calling for a government derived from the people, with separation of powers, rule of law, free elections, due process, including bail, warrants, and jury trials, the right to bear arms, for a free press and free assembly, the right to worship God according to one's own conscience, regular elections, a ban on emoluments and monopolies, and the right of the people through the representatives to enact laws that, quote, encourage virtue and suppress vice and immorality. Following the Bill of Rights was the new state constitution, once again almost identical to the North Carolina Constitution, setting up a Senate and House, a governor, and an independent judiciary. One important change they made was the elimination of a property requirement to vote for members of the House and a greatly reduced property requirement to vote for the Senate. It also reduced the property requirement to be eligible to serve as governor. But by and large, the Constitution was the same as North Carolina's. The Westerners were not looking for a very different government, just one of their own. This may have been more a matter of convenience, wanting to get something in place quickly, because the delegates also provided that there would be a second convention a year later to decide whether to make this Constitution permanent or make amendments that the people wanted. Now, following elections under this new Constitution, the new elected assembly met in March 1785 in Jonesboro. One of their first actions was to select John Sevier to be the state's governor. I've mentioned Sevier several times. He's played a leadership role in many of these meetings, but he was really not a leading advocate of the independence movement. In fact, after he learned that North Carolina had repealed its land cession and offered him a commission as a brigadier general, he actually seemed to make efforts to have the counties rejoin North Carolina and made some efforts to stop the elections. Despite his reluctance on the issue of independence, Sevier was the most respected leader in the new state, and he was nevertheless elected its first governor. Believing it his duty to carry out the will of the people, Sevier took office and organized his administration. The new assembly passed laws that established private property claims under the laws of North Carolina would continue to be respected by the Franklin government. It divided the 3 counties into what would be a total of 7 counties in the new state, including a new county named Sevier County, named for the new governor. The legislature established a state militia, a public school system, appointed various government officials, and allowed for the circulation of North Carolina currency. It established property taxes and poll taxes to fund the state government and established salaries for the governor and other various state officials. Now, perhaps the biggest issue for the new government was dealing with its neighbor, North Carolina, which still refused to accept Franklin's independence. North Carolina Governor Alexander Martin, hoping to avoid an all-out war, sent a letter to Governor Sevier, who he addressed as General Sevier. He sent Major Samuel Henderson, who had lived on the frontier for many years, to deliver the letter. Martin also wanted Henderson to give him some intelligence about what was happening. There was still some debate over whether the Franklin government had acted based on the land cession that had been repealed and might be convinced to return to North Carolina rule. Henderson also had instructions to put together a list of names of leaders of the new government and get a sense if this was the work of a few powerful men or a more broad-based movement. Henderson arrived in Jonesboro, finding the Franklin Assembly in session. He presented his letters to Sevier, who turned them over to the Assembly. Martin's letter essentially said, North Carolina offered the ceded territory to Congress for financial reasons, but Congress was not willing to accept. Therefore, the cession was reversed, and you guys are all still part of North Carolina. The Franklin Assembly responded to the letter with one of their own, once again citing the rule of no takebacks. They didn't care if the reasons for the initial land cession weren't right. The fact was that North Carolina had declared that these lands were not part of North Carolina and that they had every right to form their own government. The response also complained about North Carolina simply using these western counties as a place to collect tax revenue without ever providing government services or assistance with Indian conflicts. They ended the letter by quoting their own Declaration of Independence and asserting that Franklin was and would remain an independent state. Governor Martin realized that the western counties were not going to submit peacefully. In April of 1785, he released a manifesto to the people of western North Carolina that they were being led astray by designing men and that their revolt against the government of North Carolina would not be tolerated. Martin appealed to the people not to abandon North Carolina, as they had fought so hard for it during the Revolution. If they had complaints about North Carolina's rule, they could talk about reforms. Independence, however, was off the table. He called on the people to accept North Carolina's rule, or he would be forced to do so by military force and probably civil war. North Carolina printed and circulated Martin's manifesto to the western counties. In response, Franklin Governor Sevier printed his own proclamation, calling the manifesto an attempt to spread sedition and stir up insurrection against the Franklin government. That summer, the people of Franklin re-elected Governor Sevier. The people of North Carolina replaced Governor Martin with Richard Caswell, who had also served as governor during the Revolutionary War. The new governor, Caswell, took a softer tone, distancing himself from Martin's manifesto. He did, however, write to Sevier after taking office in June 1785, hoping that they could address the western counties' political concerns and restore political harmony under North Carolina government. He was not ready to recognize Franklin's independence either. Franklin's leaders continued to press their case. That spring, they had sent William Coke to New York to petition the Continental Congress to accept North Carolina's cession of land and to admit Franklin as the 14th state in the Union. Coke really was the ideological father of the state of Franklin. When Governor Sevier had waffled on the issue of independence, it was Coke who had convinced him to remain firmly in support of the state and to accept the governorship. Coke was a lawyer. He owned a large plantation in Franklin and had served in the North Carolina Assembly before independence. And knowing North Carolina's opposition, the Continental Congress tried to table the request to accept North Carolina's land cession despite its repeal. 7 states, however, voted to consider the matter. After some debate, supporters could not get the support of 2/3 of the states to adopt the resolution. Instead, they passed a resolution asking North Carolina to reconsider its repeal of the land cession. Encouraged by the apparent support of a majority of states in the Union, the people of Franklin continued to fight for independence. After a second annual election in the summer of 1785, a new session of the Franklin legislature met. As the first Constitutional Convention had provided, a second Constitutional Convention met that fall. The Reverend Samuel Houston offered several amendments, including a ban on office holders who engaged in swearing, gambling, drunkenness, or breaking the Sabbath. He also wanted a legislature that consisted of only a single house, and also a rule that all laws must be printed and circulated to the public before they could be voted into law. I should mention that this Sam Houston is of no relation to the Sam Houston who later became governor of Tennessee and also Texas. The convention voted down these changes, but the dispute led to a public fight, with both sides publishing pamphlets to promote their views. One pamphlet was even ordered burned by the courts after finding it to be, quote, treasonable, wicked, false, and seditious libel. Despite this controversy, the old Constitution remained largely intact. For the next few years, Franklin continued to operate as an independent state. North Carolina never conceded its independence. Like Vermont, Franklin operated as a sovereign state, but was denied membership in the Union. Governor Sevier went on to make treaties with the Cherokee, encouraged immigration into his state from its neighbors, and helped the new state continue to grow. Next week, we're going to continue this discussion of westward expansion as Congress finalizes the Treaty of Fort McIntosh and passes the Land Ordinance of 1785. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Salentano, and Michael Mulhern. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Kurt Avard, Greg Pusak, and 10 Crucial Days. I also want to thank Kevin Patterson for joining as a standard bearer last month. As with everyone who contributes at the $10 level or higher, he will receive a new magnet each month with a different flag from the American Revolution. I also want to thank Andy Bishop for a generous one-time gift via Venmo. I really do appreciate everyone who continues to support this podcast. I've noticed we've had an uptick on cancellations on Patreon lately. For those who have given support in the past, I really do appreciate it, and there's obviously no continuing obligation to give. I hope you will still listen, I hope you enjoy the show, and I do appreciate what support you've provided. But the cancellations have got me wondering if people are less interested in the post-war era. For me, some of the really interesting topics we still have to cover, especially related to the creation and adoption of the U.S. Constitution. We also have a few rebellions to cover, for those of you who like the military history aspect. So I really hope I can count on your continued support as we cover these important parts of our nation's history. I've said before that I will continue to produce episodes as long as people show an interest by supporting this podcast, and I really do hope that that happens. I also want to apologize for not publishing for the last couple of weeks. I was away for nearly a month and then got sick and also had to deal with Thanksgiving, so this all really put me behind on new episodes. But please be assured I'm back on track and plan to keep publishing weekly. For those of you who are caught up, I will mention that we will be holding our monthly roundtable this week. We will be covering the tea hysteria of 1774. Following the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, there was a movement continent-wide to just get rid of tea. And it was not just English tea. It was all tea being removed from the market for a whole host of reasons given. We'll be discussing the details of that and why it happened in a live Zoom meeting where you can interact and ask questions. If you want to receive notifications of this or future live events, please make sure you are on my mailing list. There's a link on my website and at the bottom of each blog episode. Just sign up. I don't use it for anything other than notifications for these sorts of meetings. Please join my mailing list. So this week on the main show, we covered the creation of the state of Franklin. This may be a topic with which many folks are unfamiliar, but I think it is an important one. Westward expansion becomes an important theme for America at this point, and how Western settlers fit into the Union of States is only going to become more important as more and more Americans head west. Now, there was no guarantee that westward expansion would operate as it did and lead to new states. It's quite possible that various states could have essentially treated these new territories as colonies, but given the ideals of the American Revolution, that never happened, and we ended up with a union of equal states that only grew for the next century. One other quick point that I want to make that I didn't make in the main episode was that Sam Houston's faction wanted to call the state Frank Land instead of Franklin. They thought the state should be named after a free people, not just one of the founders. In the end, though, Franklin became the established name. I hope it's not a spoiler alert to anyone that Franklin never did become a U.S. state. It existed, however, as an independent state for many years. North Carolina Governor Richard Caswell continued to assert sovereignty, but never did take military action to force the issue. Instead, he tried to address the issues that had caused the western counties to seek independence in the first place. North Carolina, though, continued to block Franklin's entry into the Continental Congress and its participation in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1777. During this time, a Loyalist movement also grew within Franklin under a man named John Tipton. This blew up into a full-scale civil war in 1788 when Tipton seized Sevier's slaves while Sevier was off with the militia fighting the Cherokee. Tipton justified this seizure as a way to collect back taxes that he said Sevier owed to his state of North Carolina. Sevier then took his militia and marched on Tipton's plantation. Tipton received loyalist reinforcements, causing Sevier's army to flee. Later, Tipton's militia managed to corner and arrest Sevier, who would eventually be charged with treason against North Carolina. This eventually led to the collapse of the Franklin government and its reintegration into North Carolina in 1788. Of course, many years later, after the reintegration, this area would break off again and eventually become the state of Tennessee, and John Sevier would become a governor of that state. What I just summarized there is a great story in and of itself, but it's so many years ahead of where we are right now, I don't want to get ahead of things, and we'll probably have a future episode that gets into all that if we ever get to 1788. That said, if this story interests you, there are a number of great books that cover this story in more detail. One of the more recent ones is my book recommendation this week. It's called The Lost State of Franklin, America's First Secession by Kevin Barksdale. It gives a good look at events, although I think the book is a little short. It's under 200 pages if you don't count the extensive notes and index section. That said, it's a pretty good read. The author, Barksdale, is a history professor at Marshall University in West Virginia, and you can also borrow his book on archive.org if you just want to take a look at it before buying. The title again is The Lost State of Franklin, America's First Secession. I have to say, though, my favorite source for this topic is an older book called The History of the Lost State of Franklin by Samuel Cole Williams. This book was published in 1910, so it's in the public domain, and I'm going to make it my online recommendation. You can, however, still purchase a paper copy of the book if you prefer to read that way. This book goes into more detail and quotes extensively from many of the primary documents. There's also an appendix, which includes the Franklin Constitution, and it also has lots of great short biographies of all the key players. If you really want to dig into this topic, take a look at The History of the Lost State of Franklin by Samuel Cole Williams. As always, I've included links to read or download the book from archive.org on my blog and website. My question this week asks about a topic that I touched on a few weeks ago. In 1783, James Madison, encouraged by Thomas Jefferson, got engaged to a 15-year-old girl named Kitty Floyd, the daughter of a New York delegate. The questioner asks, how did Kitty's dad feel about this? Well, and to preface my answer, I have to say that norms were very different in the 18th century. The 32-year-old Madison's pursuit of a 15-year-old girl was not at all considered scandalous. Women very frequently married at a very young age, and often to much older men. So, to answer your question directly, Kitty's father, William Floyd, was very pleased with the match. Madison was a man of means and had a good future ahead of him. That was what most fathers wanted for their daughters, and Floyd was very encouraging of the relationship. The reluctant one seemed to be Kitty herself. There's no good record of her reasons, but we know that Madison was rather bald, diminutive, and shy. Kitty ended up getting engaged to a 19-year-old in New York and still got married at the age of 16. Madison was devastated by this. He remained single for another decade. He pursued and married Dolly Todd in 1794. At the time, Todd was a widow. Her maiden name was Payne. Dolly had married a Philadelphia lawyer named John Todd, with whom she had 2 children. Her husband and one of her children died in Philadelphia's yellow fever epidemic of 1793. After that, she had some legal troubles with the estate and hired Aaron Burr as her attorney. Burr ended up setting her up with Madison, and the two married. It's interesting to note that although Dolly was 26 when she married the 43-year-old Madison, she was actually younger than Kitty by a year in terms of what year she was born. For those interested, Kitty's husband died in 1813 while Madison was president. She had 3 children and struggled financially, and she died in New York City at the age of 65 in 1832. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.